Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's CPD event on post-pandemic placemaking. It's an event that's joint hosted with myself and Claire McArthur, and it's an event that's fairly recently been pulled together just in terms of thinking and I suppose reviewing current events in the world with a particular emphasis, pardon me, on the kind of massive changes that we've kind of seen in day-to-day living, from sort of basic elements, from nipping out to the shops to wider kind of impacts such as our day-to-day working sort of patterns and other kind of key events that have been impacted really since the start of this year. The main sort of point of this CPD event will be to review and sort of discuss our own personal kind of interactions, specifically with changes that have been undertaken in the built environment. And this is an event that again has really come about from internal discussion amongst the Scottish Young Planners Network. A big change that we've all noticed, between our kind of work and personal home lives, is just the change that's undertaken in our sort of public spaces and places. In particular for me, I came back to Edinburgh after lockdown and noticed at first the temporary sort of changes that were undertaken, just in terms of adhering to social distancing measures, improving I suppose connectivity and what were fairly crowded places, gearing up towards obviously lockdown, where a lot of these spaces were very vacant, up to a point where we're now seeing a continued level despite the kind of lockdowns that are undergoing throughout the UK and the other kind of tiered approaches, hopefully to a point where we'll all see these places come back into greater use. So in terms of a bit of background on our speakers, I will be doing a kind of brief introduction, and Claire McArthur will be doing a sort of detailed overview of the measures that have been undertaken in Aberdeen City throughout the last couple of months, and the sort of medium and sort of long-term vision for a lot of these measures that have started off as kind of temporary fixtures in our public places into more permanent, I suppose, versions of placemaking practices and solutions really to a public health issue and sort of subsequent guidance. In terms of background, I have worked both in public and private sector over predominantly development management. I have got quite a keen interest in sort of development planning, urban design, which kind of fed into the thinking behind today's event, and really just across the board for certain projects that I work now in private practice. We do quite a lot of kind of urban sort of centre developments, particularly based around residential, commercial, and a big kind of talking point for us internally just now is in addition to key elements such as design, amenity, transportation and road issues, looking ahead really to how do we improve design and connectivity with local authorities in order to make sure that we are adhering to the public guidance that's out there in terms of health, well-being, and social distancing. I think we're all aware that obviously the pandemic hasn't and it won't be going anywhere quickly. So as much as these measures were fairly quick in appearing in some of our cities and sort of urban places, the lasting impacts are pretty key. Claire, who will be delivering her own sort of presentation and going through the various points, has extensive background in spatial and local development planning. Claire currently works in the strategic development plan team history at Aberdeen City Council. She's currently the team leader in the Masterplanning Design and Conservation Team. Claire was a really good contact when we were putting together some of the ideas for this presentation, just in terms of our current post, and obviously looking ahead to how these measures will be implemented from a kind of local authority viewpoint. I think just Claire's obviously very passionate about placemaking as well, which again leads into that additional kind of dedication to how the measures that are proposed going to be best delivered with as much minimum impact or negative impact as possible. So just in a bit more detail, as covered by the slide, the main sort of starting point for this discussion is the recent measures that we've seen, whilst probably out and about, probably not going to the offices currently, but again, no less out and about in our sort of day-to-day activities. They find it really caught, I think, our collective eye was the speed at which a lot of these measures were introduced. There's some images to follow, but I think for me personally, it was, you know, noticing small things like, you know, some demarcated or additional sort of cycling lanes that had been expanded, right through to, you know, physical, you know, interventions. So, for example, the use of street furniture, much like in, you know, a lot of kind of restaurants and bars, I think making it a bit less, you know, physical and obtrusive, but at the same time, you know, being able to achieve the sort of set physical distance criteria was quite interesting. Another point that we're looking to discuss today is, you know, can these measures, as much as they're, you know, first and foremost used to tackle the public, you know, health guidance, is there a longer term, you know, benefit that can be had here? So in particular, you know, there's been an increase in an uptake in, you know, cycling and the use of kind of outdoor spaces, particularly during the summer months. And I think that we want to kind of focus on, you know, how can these measures potentially lead to greater kind of rollout of, you know, future efforts and sort of you know, positivity around, you know, changing spaces and getting a good balance between, you know, road users, you know, pedestrians, those that are out running, walking, cycling, how that can all sort of align into a system that works pretty well. In some ways, I think, you know, certainly the last couple of months have almost acted as a sort of stimulus for, you know, ongoing work that's been delivered, you know, throughout Scotland and the UK, you know, especially in cities where there has been quite a big push for, you know, greater use of cycling, you know, safer cycling routes particularly has been something that's been at the forefront of a lot of news recently, just with the cars, you know, the car usage starting to jump up to kind of pre-pandemic levels, and maintaining a good balance between, you know, a variety of different users is also quite a key point. So just to move on, the images that are shown were taken by myself just really out and about in Edinburgh. The sort of the streetscape image there was quite stark for myself. That's Chambers Street, which, you know, is in the sort of heart of the old town. You know, one thing that really kind of hit home for me was, you know, how quiet the streets were even after, you know, kind of some easing of lockdown, obviously prior to the current kind of picture in terms of case numbers and sort of general spread. But that image there was really at the very kind of end of the kind of severe lockdown, when there was a bit more freedom of movement. And, you know, it's a fairly good example, I suppose, of, you know, pre sort of pandemic street interventions really, which are kind of demarcated lanes for, you know, loading bays, parking, not a great deal of kind of cycle sort of lanes, or, you know, increased kind of width. Obviously it's based off a historic kind of landscape, a historic kind of layout for a city, where you'd have your wider boulevards, almost like a new town, you know, approach to a lot of these places, and, you know, creating that kind of wider road usage space with, you know, fairly limited you know, pavement space for a variety of users. The central image is actually the most recent out of the three. I think this actually in itself is quite interesting, just in terms of, you know, ongoing works that are taken. This is just at the start of Fountain Bridge, just off of Lothian Road. So again, a very kind of busy part of Edinburgh. What I find quite interesting here is, I don't think anybody would have imagined seeing, you know, the yellow sign, you know, even a couple of months ago. But I think that it's at the forefront now, where, you know, the works that are ongoing have again limited the space that's available for, you know, specifically pedestrians. And again, the kind of added issue with that is that, you know, social distancing, as a disclaimer, isn't possible. But I know that, you know, throughout kind of the works that have taken place and the speed that the works had to take place, there has been obviously quite a lot of kind of discussion, you know, amongst communities. You know, certainly around the area where I live, I think there was a kind of mixed reception, which is something that Claire will sort of touch on in more detail, in terms of, you know, the sort of overnight changes really, be it from people that were used to, you know, using the kind of dedicated spaces before, specifically road users. Overnight, that kind of, I suppose, landscape has very much changed. And I think this image again was just pretty striking, where you've almost got, you know, the kind of revised position now of, well, you know, the social distancing, which we're all very much aware of now, isn't possible, and what should be a sort of safe space for that. And finally, the image on the right there, that's again just on Lothian Road itself. That's a fairly recent image that actually shows, you know, these temporary works in a bit more detail. And obviously, looking at that, you've got, you know, the demarcated cycle space, pedestrian space and original pavement. And there's been a kind of evolution over, you know, the last couple of months where, you know, at the start of the kind of measures that were introduced, it was really a case of, you know, temporary cones, then the paint, you know, and then actual physical sort of demarcated barriers. It is quite similar to examples in, you know, sort of European cities, Copenhagen, Amsterdam, you know, places that are probably more centred on cycling as a mode of transport, where you've got, you know, the demarcated lane. But it's just a kind of example of where we're at now, you know, in terms of the physical changes and the long-lasting changes that have been put in place. So I will hand over to Claire, who will go in more detail, just looking at these types of changes in Aberdeen and the sort of journey that's been taken, as well as, you know, looking forward to the kind of longer term, I suppose, legacy of the changes, and, you know, how these can be used for positive uses.
That's great. Thanks so much, Jay, for that introduction. If you bear with me, I will just show you on my screen. Hopefully you can see that. Jay, give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen.
Looking good.
Fabulous. Great. Super. Thank you. Okay, well, thanks very much for that introduction, Jay, and for a brief outline of what's been happening in Edinburgh over recent months. I'm delighted to have been asked to speak to you all today. I can see from my toolbar in front of me that we've got about 76 people on the call, which is a great number and something that we would never have had in the same meeting room probably if we were doing this in person. So it's a really good way for us to share knowledge with each other, even in these strange times. Although the invitation to speak to the Young Planners Network did come with a bit of a realisation that I'm probably no longer a young planner myself, probably instead be described as a soon-to-be mid-career planner, which unfortunately means it's probably all downhill from here. So on that happy note, I'll get us started and start the show. Okay, so I've been asked to speak a little bit about post-pandemic planning and placemaking, but I wanted to start with a bit of an urban and social history lesson first. So what I'm going to do before we get into the real crux of the Aberdeen interventions is look at a bit of pre-pandemic planning and placemaking, whether there is indeed such a thing. And then I'll go on to talk about the mid-pandemic planning and placemaking, what we've all been doing for the past 6 months or so. And really that's based on our Spaces for People interventions. And then go on to post-pandemic planning and placemaking, really looking at, you know, what's next for the profession and the development industry generally. And is this going to be our next paradigm shift when it comes to policy and practice? So when I was looking at the delegate list for today, I realised that there was quite a few people and organisations, not from Scotland, but not necessarily from the UK generally. So I thought I'd better start with a bit of an introduction to Aberdeen. We are a port city on the northeast coast of Scotland. The local authority area of Aberdeen City is roughly the same size as the dot that you can see on the screen there, with the rest of the pink being Aberdeenshire and our city region. We've got a population of about 230,000 and we're Scotland's third largest city. We're not just a city by the sea, but we're a city of the sea in terms of our title as Energy Capital of Europe, which is really linked to strong economic growth due to the prevalence of the oil and gas industry across the city. We're also known though as the Granite City or the Silver City, and that's really to do with granite being historically the predominant external building material across the city. And as of a few weeks ago, we are very proud to have been announced as the UK Local Authority of the Year at the Municipal Journal Achievement Awards. So just a couple of context shots about Aberdeen city centre, just in case any of you might not necessarily have been and visited us. This shot really shows the close proximity of the harbour to the city and the main urban core. And the street that you can see at the bottom of your screen, where the yellow hatch box is, that is Union Street, and that's our primary street for retail and leisure. And this is what Union Street looks like, or looked like pre-lockdown. A really busy street. It's the heart of the city. It's the heart of the wider city region. It's also, however, a key transport corridor, both in relation to public transport, in relation to buses, but also for private car, being a key route that people use to get from A to B across the city. But we'll come back to Union Street later in the presentation, just to show the interventions that we've had to put in place in response to the COVID pandemic. Because as we've all realised relatively recently, the things that make our cities great, the crowds, the attractions, all the things to do, at the moment, they're the same things that can make our cities the most vulnerable. So for now, and indulge me here a little bit, if you will, a brief trip back in time to what might be called pre-pandemic days, if indeed there is such a thing. And the answer to that is probably not pre-pandemic. There's probably no such thing as pre-pandemic planning. This image shows Aberdeen in the late 1800s, and as we all know, the origins of our planning system lie in needs to tackle poor public health and the housing conditions of the 19th century. Cholera, typhoid, smallpox epidemics really brought about the understanding for the need for clean water supplies and sewage systems, and really the link between quality of the environment, living conditions, and really public health and planning's base map in these times. And I think the interesting thing about cholera in particular is that 50% of those who contracted cholera died. So like COVID-19, it really was a disease that knew no social boundaries. And the role and importance of planning as central to tackling public health really can't be underestimated, and our response to COVID-19 should really be no different. So moving on now to the current pandemic, as it were, the COVID-19 public health emergency, and one word really to describe how all this started out for me personally, but I'm sure for many others listening on the call today, and that's quite simply, well, it's more of a scream than a word, really, but there we are. I'm sure I'm not alone for that was the first thing that came into mind when all of this started to really kick off. And for me, as well as the mental stress of the global pandemic, turning our lives upside down, forcing us to work from home, I also had two small people at home to keep safe, well, and most importantly, happy and carefree. And I think that context, and it's not just myself who's been in this position, that context of all of us working from home at the moment, all with our personal responsibilities as well, is really important to bear in mind in terms of the work that we've managed to achieve over the last few months. And the eagle-eyed amongst you will notice a potty and a roll of toilet roll in the background of this picture. So here's an important lesson for you. Never decide to potty train a toddler at the start of a lockdown when there are very limited supplies of toilet roll. I'll just tell you now, it's just not worth it. So after the initial stress of the pandemic, we quickly composed ourselves, both personally and professionally, and committed ourselves really to doing our job in the best way that we could. But remembering first and foremost to be kind to each other as we felt our way really through the darkness of those early days and onwards to what I'm really calling here is mid-pandemic planning, where we're really in the midst of it. And in particular, the spaces for people project and the support we were able to give to businesses. And before I get started on these next few slides, I do want to make it clear that I'll be saying the word we quite a lot. That's because the Spaces for People project within Aberdeen City Council has truly been a monumentous achievement, and it's been achieved from services right across the council, and something that we're really proud to have worked together on and worked together on remotely as well. So a brief bit of context for you in terms of impact on the transport system of COVID and lockdown. During the height of lockdown, motorised vehicle usage dropped by about 66% of pre-lockdown rates. Train passenger numbers were down by about 75%. Bus passenger numbers down by about 76%, and walking and cycling increased by a fantastic 80 to 85%. Obviously, this being in line with Scottish Government encouragement to get out and walk and cycle more. So in terms of Spaces for People, at the end of April, the Scottish Government announced the creation of Spaces for People project, which has been managed by Sustrans. The quote there on your screen, Spaces for People, is a new temporary infrastructure programme in Scotland which offers funding and support to make it safer for people who choose to walk, cycle or wheel for essential trips and exercise during COVID-19. In Aberdeen City Council were awarded 1.76 million from this fund, and that was to carry out temporary works across the city, and I'll just stress temporary works across the city, to provide space to physically distance in line with these government requirements. The big aim in all this to reduce the COVID-19 transmission across the city, which we hope would in turn reduce the number of cases that our partners in the NHS were having to cope with. Secondary aim, however, was very much to assist with economic recovery, and particularly in relation to the city centre. So what I want to do is talk to you a little bit more about the SFP interventions that we had across the city. You can find out more about those that we undertook across our town centres from the dedicated pages on the council's website for coronavirus. But I'm just going to run through some of the primary changes in the city centre here today. So firstly, temporary pedestrianisation of a large part of Union Street and School Hill, both of which had been identified as areas of heavy pedestrian activity pre-lockdown. So here's a reminder, Union Street pre-COVID, a busy place, cars, buses and people. And another shot here further down, which I think really illustrates well the narrow area that was really available for pedestrians when you take into account not only traffic movements, but also street furniture, bus stops, bins, post boxes, etc., etc. So not much room left for people to safely practice physical distancing, particularly given the need for us to consider reduced capacities in shops, and for people to potentially be queuing outside as well. So closing part of Union Street to motorised traffic was one of the first things that we did, and these photographs were literally taken, I think, on about day 3 of the closure. And it shows what I've started to refer to as the 10 famous traffic cones that really started off the whole thing. And here's a shot from the other ends of the Union Street pedestrian zone, again showing early days and the sort of small number of cones that really started us off on our journey here. And a further shot just showing all the space that has been created for physical distancing by closing this part of Union Street to motorised traffic. And allowing more space to be utilised when non-essential shops were able to reopen, because at this time we were still very much in the early days of lockdown when the Scottish Government's route map had been published, but we still weren't sure of the fixed dates in terms of reopening the city centre. So moving over now to our other temporary pedestrian zone, this is the Upper Kirkgate School Hill area, again pre-lockdown, a very busy space and particularly high levels of pedestrians here. due to two large shopping malls on either side of the pedestrian crossing that you can see in the picture there. And again, just some shots showing the road closed to motorised vehicles, and again, the small number of traffic cones that started us on this journey. And again, here we go, the other side of the closure here on Upper Kirkgate. So going back to our list, another intervention was widening of footpaths and separating out bus stops. Now, just in relation to widening footpaths, in areas of Union Street that weren't pedestrianised, bus lanes and carriageway space was reallocated in order to become a temporary part of the footpath. Again, in the first instance, this was done very simply and ultimately very quickly, because that was our priority here with simple traffic cones. And this extension allowed able-bodied people to use both areas of what was now the new footway, but also still ensured space for people with mobility issues to use existing footpaths and crossing points safely. We quickly realised, however, that it's going to be essential for us to humanise these measures in order for people to feel more comfortable, and that's where our tactical urbanism interventions really came in. And what started as a few cones at one end of Union Street quickly became more substantial barriers, which we attempted to soften with the introduction of a few planters. And then we added a few more planters, and then we added a few more again. And these planters within the central strip of the pedestrian zone were really also to encourage behavioural change and draw people away from the pavements where, you know, historically that would have been the obvious place to walk. And really draw them into what was now the space for physical distancing without the threat of motorised vehicles. We started looking at these measures to try and make people feel more relaxed in these spaces, so that people would feel safe, not just in terms of their physical health on the basis that they had space to practice physical distancing, but also relaxed in terms of their mental health as well, in terms of they were able to enjoy visiting these spaces. Other softening measures included the move away from traffic cones to more slender traffic wands, which could be glued into the road surface in order to keep them in place. And although, you know, moving to the traffic wands was the next stage in terms of softening, there was also a practical issue here in terms of we only had so many traffic cones in the city. We were very close at one point, I think, to putting out an amnesty call to all students in the city to say any traffic cones you've got in your living room, we need them back sharpish. Thankfully, we didn't need to go that far, and we managed to source a good supply of traffic wands, these ones that you can see in the picture here, in order to get us through. And another reason to move to the traffic wands and other interventions in the widened footpath was really to make them feel less like roads. We were having issues with cars still driving into these spaces, as you can see from the image on the left here, but also cyclists who were using these spaces and at great speed as well, you know, sort of talking about 20-mile-an-hour cyclists whizzing down Union Street at some points. So we wanted to encourage cyclists back onto the defined road rather than using these widened footpath areas. So we introduced our take on the parklets, a quick, easy to construct wooden unit that could basically be slotted into these widened footpaths to add a bit of interest, introduce a place of refuge, but also to try and humanise these spaces even further. So this image shows a grouping of parklets, and there's no fancy planting or greenery in these, but you'll see photos of them shortly. But this grouping was placed outside one of the larger community pharmacies on Union Street, which again, you know, was a key place for people to be visiting, even during the early days of the pandemic, and continues to be so today. And the parklets provided what we call an at-grade extension to the footpath. So they were the same level, no need to step down at all. You just smoothly glid onto the parklet surface. And we introduced non-slip strips in order to make sure that they were safe in all weathers as well. And the design and installation of the parklets was all undertaken in-house. And we were thrilled to have the chair of the local Disability Equity Partnership act as a critical friend for us during this process as well, to make sure that people that had mobility issues were also being considered as part of the design. So here's another shot of some parklets outside one of the supermarkets on Union Street, and as you can see better in this photo, our gardeners have been doing a great job introducing planting to again try and soften and humanise these interventions. And another shot here, from the early days, the parklets have been really well used and enjoyed, and I particularly like this shot as it shows, and you hopefully will be able to see to the left of the image, it's a family of cyclists, and they are in the road space of Union Street rather than the extended footway. And just even to have a family cycling down Union Street is something that would have been a very rare sight pre-lockdown. And just briefly, a few more shots of people enjoying the parklets, and this is over in the School Hill area, just outside of the newly reopened Aberdeen Art Gallery. And as of today, we have 146 parklets installed in clusters across the city centre. And I'm delighted to say we're now working with Sustrans to produce a case study on the parklets so that our journey and learning can be shared with other local authorities across Scotland. So going back to our list, we also had a great close working relationship with the DEP, and that was important to us as we look to provide ramps and platforms for people with mobility issues. Some shots here of the initial portable plastic ramps that were introduced down the widened pavement areas, predominantly as a way to assist people to access buses which could no longer pull up to the kerb line. So we worked with the DEP to try out temporary metal bus boarding ramps, and as you can see, some photographs here of the test session that was undertaken with members of the DEP and the bus companies, who were very good to give up their time to help out with this. We also tried the parklet model in this way, and it was found to be a really successful option in terms of allowing bus boarding in an easy manner. So we moved the bus stops. We'd already by this point undertaken an exercise to separate out bus stops to reduce instances of conflicted queues. And we now introduced additional wooden bus stop platforms and totem signage, encouraging people to use extended footpath areas to queue for buses, thereby leaving space on the pavement for pedestrians to physically distance. And the platforms and totems, because they were in the same design and style of materials as the parklets, made them clearly recognisable, but also visually pleasing. And before we move on, I just wanted to add that in addition to all we looked at in the city centre, we also had creation of temporary cycle lanes and additional cycle parking, as well as temporary bus gates and one-way systems. So a real power of work that went into the primary changes within the city centre. So as I mentioned earlier, economic recovery has also been something we've been working hard to try and support, and we've done that in one way by working with the hospitality industry. Really basing ourselves on the correspondence from Scotland's Chief Planner to take a pragmatic and flexible approach at the moment in order to allow diversification. So takeaways and deliveries, businesses that are trying to diversify that would normally have required planning consent for a temporary period of time, we're willing to look at not taking an enforcement action for those diversifications. We've also been working with the hospitality industry for those that are interested in creating outdoor seating areas. Now in the northeast of Scotland, it's not necessarily been that popular to sit outside due to the weather, but there's nothing that says that it can't be done with a blanket and some heaters. So we have looked to try and take a joined up approach within the council in terms of the input from planning, roads, building standards, licensing and environmental health. And I think I'd say about 85 businesses at current levels have come forward to us, and we've managed to assist by giving them temporary outdoor seating areas across the city centre. And one way that we were able to help was to produce what we called our Guidelines for Business document, which is a live document on our website, which provides up-to-date guidance for hospitality interested in utilising outdoor seating opportunities. So there's guidance there about design principles, what type of tables and chairs, how they should be cleaned, information about marquees, really a one-stop shop in terms of information for people interested in outdoor seating. We also had a dedicated email address that businesses could contact us on. And colleagues in economic development worked with these businesses to see if any grant funding could become available. And most recently, we've been providing advice on what we can only describe as winterproofing. As they say in the northeast of Scotland, we do have to think about these things more than some other areas. Snow loading on marquees, gritting and salting of slippy surfaces, and also windproofing to make sure that everyone is as safe as possible using these spaces. So here's a couple of photos that I'll just flick through quickly just to show you properties that had no outdoor seating previously, but because of the spaces for people interventions that we initiated throughout the city and the city centre, able to utilise on-street areas for outdoor seating. You'll see in these photographs that, I'll just flick back quickly, the seating itself is in the carriageway. It's not on the pavement. And in areas like this, pavements again have been left clear so that there is a clear route for pedestrians to pass by safely, but also a clear route for those with mobility issues, parents with prams and things to be able to get past without interference. This particular space is within one of the public parks in the city, and we were approached by an operator who we worked with to create an outdoor seating area within a quadrant of the public park outside their property, and it's turned out quite successful. And of course, in the city centre, the parklets had another use here again, in that they could be taken over by cafes and restaurants who might have had little other opportunity for outdoor seating at their disposal. So a couple of shots of those. So just touching briefly on consultation, from the outset of the pandemic and spaces for people, it was very clear that the normal approach we would have to consulting on a project such as this simply would not be possible. We had to act quickly, we had to act decisively, and we had to do all we could to address the public health emergency that we were faced with. So instead of consulting on a proposal, taking feedback, making amendments and then acting, we acted first based on our best intentions and undertook post-installation engagement in order to see if we needed to alter or refine the measures which had been undertaken. And we did this through our City Council consultation portal, and indeed that portal is still open now, so any comments on spaces for people measures can still be made to us. And also the Sustrans mapped base portal was open through June to August of this year. We also attended where we could, and this was attended virtually, community council meetings for the community councils in the city if they were still meeting, and business group and other stakeholders as well, just to try and engage with these groups post installation to see if any changes were required. And we also looked to get the word out as much as we possibly could. You'll see the advert on the bus stop in the photo. We also used social media and the press, coronavirus pages of our website, and also dedicated email addresses again, so that anyone with a concern could get straight to a member of the team who would be able to reply. So in terms of spaces for people, just looking at our outcomes in relation to transport, traffic is back at about 90% of pre-lockdown rates. However, we're not really seeing any morning peak. Number of buses, well, that has increased to about 123% and about 73% during lockdown. And a lot of that is to do with physical distancing on buses, in terms of more buses being required as less people can actually sit on a bus. Pedestrian and cycle levels are still high, and they have, although they have fallen, they're still remarkably strong. Pedestrian levels sitting at about 139% and cycling levels of 137%. And city centre footfall rates are beginning to rise, albeit slowly, and we're interested to see what our counters say about the next few weeks in the run-up to Christmas. And just before I finish this section, I'm just going to blow our own trumpet a little bit here, because we're delighted this week to learn that the Aberdeen City Council COVID response, and particularly in relation to empowering staff to work from home while still maintaining services, has been shortlisted for the prestigious Project Management Institute UK National Project Award. And we're shortlisted against other projects such as HM Revenue and Customs Eat Out to Help Out Job Retention Scheme, and also the Oxford University's COVID trial. So no pressure there in terms of the competition that we're up against, but we are delighted with that announcement this week. So moving on now, and looking forward, we really need to ensure that as we gradually return to normality, for want of a better word, we don't lose sight of the lessons that we've learned from this pandemic. And what do we do now? Well, economically resilient cities and socially healthy communities have always been important, but really even more so now. And resilience for me is really the key word in all of this. As planners, we are particularly known as a profession that is innovative, adaptive, but also resilient. And now more than ever, we need to translate that into our towns, cities, and communities. And I think this is a really key moment for the profession as we embark on what could be our next paradigm shift in terms of policy and placemaking in practice. And we already have a lot of tools we need at our disposal. For example, the Planning Scotland Act, which received royal assent of July of next year, has a real focus already on health and well-being. And it's likely that stronger partnerships between planning and public health that were emerging before COVID are only going to continue to get stronger as we move forward. As the graphic shows on the screen, as little as 10% of a population's health and well-being is linked to access to healthcare. And I think really the last 6 months have just really cemented that for us all. And I just want to shine a spotlight on work that colleagues in the local development plan team have been doing in relation to all this, albeit the work they have done in the proposed Aberdeen local development plan and its health and well-being has been more in the context of pre-COVID health emergencies such as smoking, obesity, alcoholism and drug dependency. But the next proposed local development plan does take a health and all policies approach, and a lot of the policies have been co-designed with NHS Grampian, which is a really interesting and exciting approach for us. And the proposed plan introduction was described recently as part of the Planner Live Scotland sessions by Irene Buteman, our RTPI Scotland convener, as absolutely perfect. And really, we can't really ask for much higher praise than that. Irene, you will need to watch out, because historically when people have said nice things about us, we have had a tendency to get it printed up on mugs. So just to warn you, the next time you pop up for a coffee, you may see that quote emblazoned on a mug somewhere. But specifically, the proposed plan has a specific chapter on health and well-being, and really does look to tackle healthy placemaking, prepared pre-COVID, but just as important now as we move forward. Health impact assessments also going to be a really important tool for development management colleagues in terms of looking to positively impact health outcomes from development that comes forward. And just before we finish up, here's my attempt to gaze into the crystal ball and see where we might go from here. So a table now, and if you just indulge me with this, really going from what we're moving from to. So first up here, looking at physical contact, some may say unnecessary physical contact, and really moving to, I think, digital transformation is really going to become even more important. And that's urban and rural levels, and really interconnected digital strategies. There's no point in a health board having one digital strategy and other community planning partners, other industries across the city working from a different strategy, and those not talking to each other. We all need to make sure all of our digitisation is interconnected. And also looking at contactless technologies as well. We're all used to paying in shops and restaurants contactless, but I'm sure many of you have seen across cities in the world that the task of pushing a button on a pedestrian crossing has been removed to try and again just stop that potentially unnecessary physical contact with the built environment. And this is potentially an obvious one, but from inside, really to focus now on outside, well ventilated spaces and natural light, even more important than they ever were. And I think this is really where we're going to see a shift in our architectural response, and be that floor plans, a move away from large open plan areas, but also waste strategies from a public authority level. Does every property require 2 or 3 individual wheelie bins when shared communal facilities could be looked at instead? But also material choices. We've seen in the research over the last 6 months that plastic and stainless steel, coronavirus on these surfaces can remain active for around about 3 days, whereas the ions in copper alloys, which are both antiviral and antibacterial just by nature, mean that coronavirus on these types of surfaces normally only survive for a few hours at best. So I think that's going to be an interesting thing to watch out for as well. But also looking at what was probably the past rather than the most recent, of single isolated land uses, areas identified just for business or just for residential in terms of their zoning. Looking now to more mixed use and really self-sufficient areas. We've all, those of us living in cities certainly, have been living in neighbourhoods for the last 6 months rather than necessarily living in our cities. And we need to empower what I'm calling here is sustainable community catchments to really make sure that things like social isolation as well as use isolation can be tackled, and looking at mutual aid as to how we do that. And a move away potentially from traditional office working and traditional retail cores to flexible co-working hubs. But in terms of retail cores, I think what we might start to see a shift is in relation to cultural cores as well. There's still a place for the nighttime economy, and there's still a place for people to gather to have shared experiences. And I think that's where our cities and town centres are heading. And lack of green and open space has really been highlighted across the pandemic. So I think a move to ensuring better garden provision, parks, but also pop-up greenery and spaces for self-sufficiency in terms of food growing. Certainly, I'm aware of a number of people that had never grown any fruit or vegetables, but at the start of the pandemic now are budding gardeners and are looking to their own food security through their own open space. And finally, and again, a bit of an obvious one here, we were already trying to move away from reliance on the private car, and I think transport independence is becoming much more important now. And that's where a move to more active travel infrastructure is really going to be key. But most importantly, in order to move forward, it's going to be absolutely critical for us to listen to the voices of communities. They are the people that have experienced the direct impacts and consequences of one of the worst public health crises we've had in a century. And it's only by us listening and working together that I think places are going to be able to truly heal, but then also to develop that resilience to tackle what might come next. And talking about what might come next, I can't end without addressing the small matter of the global climate emergency that was obviously with us pre-COVID, but continues to be with us now. And some research suggests could increase the likelihood of more pandemics in the future. So that's always something for us to look forward to. So we have experienced a temporary dip in greenhouse gases over the time of COVID, but we still need to fundamentally change the way that we're living our lives. Scottish Government does have some of the most ambitious climate change targets in the world, but we've still got a far way to go, and I'm sure that'll be one of the main points of discussion at the COP26 climate change conference in Glasgow next year. So just finally, I think, if we don't start to take decisive steps now, we are much more likely to slip back into old patterns. And it's interesting on that basis to look at the Scottish Government's Just Transition Commission, the report that they put out over the summer, which talked about economic recovery in relation to coronavirus, consistent with climate ambitions, but also looks to target inequality and promote regional cohesion as well. So if you made it this far and you're still listening, thank you very much. I thought I'd end with this photo of a rainbow ending at Aberdeen's Royal Infirmary, just to give us a little bit of hope of the future to come. And I'll pass over now back to Jay, just in terms of any questions. Thank you.
That was brilliant. Thanks for that, Claire. It was really good just to get a kind of overview on a sort of specific case study. So I'll just kick off. We've got a question from Catherine Crerar, and she's asked if you foresee the measures being kept long term. I think that's something I'd picked up on as well, specifically the planters and the more sort of soft kind of interventions were, from a kind of urban space point, really attractive. But I suppose, practically it's the balance now as we go back towards, busier kind of like town centres, city centres. Is there a balance to be sought? Is it just, adapting? Is that going to be key in terms of how we look to kind of balance the two factors?
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting point in terms of what does come next. We've been very clear as the City Council that all the interventions that we've done are temporary interventions. They have only been implemented as a direct result of the public health crises, and when there is no longer a requirement to physically distance, then we will look at removing those measures. So in terms though of things like the softer side, like the planters and the parklets in particular, we do hope to move those to other parts of the city, potentially community groups, to make sure that they are well used afterwards. But certainly, in terms of what comes next, I'm still only looking to next week, because that's all it's safe to do at the moment. It's look week to week ahead, and certainly, everything that we've put forward at the moment is deemed as temporary only. Brilliant,
that's great. And got a few other questions coming in now. So the next one is from Ian Goggin, and it was basically talking about community engagement. Obviously that was quite a key topic in terms of the placemaking, and where do you envisage this fitting in with the neighbourhood planning as a kind of short, medium and long term approach?
Yeah, one of the things that my team have been looking at is the introduction of local place plans. And it was something we were working with our community forum with before lockdown in terms of interest in local place plans. And obviously for the last few months, interest has been tailing off as communities focus on immediate concerns and pressures. But I think, looking at local place plans and neighbourhood plans is going to be really important in terms of doing, as I said, listening to communities. What did you find worked well in your local area during the pandemic? What didn't work so well? How can we look at resilience and making changes, but also when we come to new areas of the city, and my team again look at master planning large new sustainable mixed use communities across the city. What lessons can we learn there in terms of new master plans that are created? What measures can we put in for that resilience to really take hold? I think is going to be really important.
No, perfect. And quite a good sort of segue now, a question from Helen Atkinson, and it's specifically asking in terms of, obviously community engagement was quite key. How, specifically in Aberdeen, how did you find local businesses reacted in terms of the parking restrictions and, the potential kind of loss of some of that space? I mean, I know loading bays were, kind of reallocated, and generally speaking, a lot of these on-site deliveries were impacted. Specifically your key businesses like your pharmacies and whatnot during sort of, the depth of lockdown and coming out of that.
Yeah, and I'm not going to lie, it was really difficult. Really, really difficult to get all of these different stakeholders to a point where they could operate safely. The thing I always say about planning is that you can't please all of the people all of the time, but at least normally somebody is happy with what happens. At some points during, the lockdown, it did come across of, you can't do right for doing wrong, and really that was a measure of not pushback necessarily about the interventions that were being pushed forward, that were being put in place, but actually nobody wanted coronavirus. Nobody asked for it. We certainly didn't either. So it was really, although initially we had to work really hard to build those relationships, we always had to keep in mind that this wasn't our fault as much as it wasn't the traders' fault. And it wasn't an ideal solution, and we had to work together. It was our duty to provide safe spaces within the city centre. If we weren't providing those safe spaces for people to physically distance, then potentially those businesses may not have been able to operate. So we all had to work together, and loading and parking was one of the bigger issues at the start. But that's where the sort of post installation consultation came out, and we made tweaks, we made changes in areas of the city to try and address those things where we could and where we felt it would benefit the wider whole.
Brilliant. Well, I'm just conscious of time. If there was any kind of additional last questions we could address, obviously the session's been recorded and it's there for reference. There's some really nice comments actually during the presentation, just noting how great it is to kind of see an example of a kind of large urban area, specifically somewhere that is as vibrant as Aberdeen. And I will just go, I think I've got a final question here. Here we go. So from Ash Sony, and they have asked career paths to date for Claire and myself. I think I could probably do a quick summary. I mean, for myself, it's really again been, I graduated fairly recently, sort of 5 years ago, and it's predominantly been sort of public sector and sort of private sector planning. Great kind of grounding in sort of public sector at the start of my career, and then also working in private sector across the whole kind of like breadth of sectors in terms of development, always in DM, and some sort of experience in development planning. But I think I'd definitely recommend that the balance is key for both areas. Obviously Claire's focused more on the sort of master planning and spatial side, but I'll hand over on that one.
Yeah, I think, you know, nobody's background was going to prepare them for this. That's probably my answer to that question. We've all been grasping, doing jobs that we never really expected. But yeah, in terms of this is obviously a young planners event. So my message to anyone that's listening that started their career is to get as much experience in all the different parts of planning as you possibly can. Because it's not until you try something out that you think, well, actually, this is for me and this is what I can do.
No, definitely. Well, that seems to be a good way to round off. But again, really appreciate, you know, the kind of turnout for this event. Obviously, it's something that I don't think anybody imagined we'd be talking about, you know, this time last year, just in terms of the scale. But I think take a lot of heart from the approach. And again, I think it shows planning in a shining light, you know, the resilience and the kind of reactionary nature, you know, in terms of kind of safeguarding the long term, you know, viability of cities and local economies and sort of underpinned with the health agenda. It's been absolutely brilliant. So thanks again for the input, Claire. It was really, really interesting and good to see, you know, the kind of passion that comes across just in terms of, you know, maximising, you know, our urban spaces, especially in the face of something, you know, as daunting as a pandemic. It's been really good and really reassuring. And obviously the presentation will be made available, and you know, contact details can be shared for myself and Claire if there's any kind of follow-on questions or queries.
Great, thank you all very much.
Perfect.